In terms of perspective, I thought the way that I might enter into this was to tell you a story, because again, stories come from those landings. And of course, I have a lot of landings in Western Pennsylvania, and if things are okay in Western Pennsylvania, then they're really okay. I mean, we expect them to be okay here in Virginia, you know. I mean, right? And Washington and all these great places. I mean, can anything good come out of Pittsburgh? No. Many have asked that question. Never forget Archbishop Munir Anis, who, when I was deposed, there is a question about whether I'm the 7th and the 8th or the 8th or whatever number of Bishop Pittsburgh I happen to be. Munir wrote to me the day I was deposed, and he said, "This is your finest moment." I said, "That's easy for you to say." Nara shakes her head, yes. The perspective that I want to share as servant of the servants of God, tell a story from just this past Sunday about seven young men and one young woman. Every one of the 8 is under 30 years old. I just happened to be on visitation. There were 178 people there for that visitation. Happened to be at our church called Grace in Slippery Rock, congregation that's just 4 years old. Of the 178 were there, 150 were undergraduates, which is a pretty good thing. Road trips, you know. I mean, my niece, who's a senior at Mount Holyoke, is here somewhere, and I was talking with she's in the back somewhere. We were talking about road trips and what it used to be like when I, as a Trinity grad, would go visit Mount Holyoke, but we didn't talk too much about what it was like. I mean, in any case, Grace Slippery Rock. I met 2 young men named Ben and Colin. When Ben was 10 and Colin was 10, they told me. Colin, who was part of a Methodist youth gathering in his church, brought Ben, who came from a family who didn't know, had no Christian connection at all, brought his friend Ben to that youth gathering in that Methodist church. And they've been friends ever since. And on Sunday, Ben was being confirmed at Grace Slippery Rock, and Colin had journeyed all the way from Columbia, South Carolina. He's a senior there too. Ben's a senior. And they stayed in touch and obviously proud of one another. Colin actually shared with me over a beer after confirmation. Well, because that was important, I was told by the 29-year-old rector, Ethan, that if I just went and had a beer with him, I understood that this would be an important part of their spiritual development. And they delighted in telling me that the dark beer we were drinking was called Catherine the Great, but that was another story. Well, you got to notice these things. Even when you're at 30,000 feet, you got to keep, coming down and sort of noticing what's going on the ground. Colin told me that he actually believes he's called to ordination, and he wants to teach Old Testament, and he wants to go to a secular university in order to study Old Testament, and he wants to serve in a secular university so that he can witness as a Christian, just like he did when he was 10 years old to Ben. Praise God for Colin. Colin, incidentally, is a member of an Anglican mission in the Americas church in Columbia. How about that? The other young man that I confirmed on Sunday was a fellow named Charlie, a junior. He also shared with me that he thinks he has a vocation, just as Ben also shared that when he was 16, he was called to the ministry, the ordained ministry. So that's 3 with a mention of Ethan, who's the 29-year-old rector. Then present were also another Ben and Brian, whom I confirmed last year. And they're both in seminary now, and they were just recently at the Anglican 1000 conference, and they came away with their rector, Ethan, telling him, this is what it's all about. This is what we want to give our lives to, planting churches. Okay, so that's 6 of them. Seventh is a young man who actually did business at Grove City College, which is where Grace Slippery Rock is. A young man named Dan who came back from Buffalo that night so that he could present to me his fiancée. And he said, "We want to plant a church in Buffalo." He's in business. I mean, there's no danger of a bishop, at least at the present time, laying hands on him. But again, we actually need a lot of lay folk doing a lot of church planting, not just the ordained. And so that's Charlie and Ben and Colin and Ben and Brian and Dan and Ethan, who's the rector. So that's the 7 guys, most of them 20, 21, 22, and a fiancé, and then one who's 29. And then there was the email that came in on Monday morning. This is really from the gal that I'm sure I was introduced to her. The email didn't tell me what her name was. Came from her dad, who's actually a priest I don't know, in Kentucky. And he said in an email to Archbishop at AnglicanChurch.net, he said, "My daughter called last night, and she was so excited about the Archbishop's visit and about what he preached on and about the confirmations. And she said, 'I'm just in love with the Archbishop,'" which was kind of nice. But, there's hope for all of us. And he wrote, "For a father and a priest, nothing could make me happier." Now, one other detail of that picture, which is the present of the Anglican Church in North America, and also clearly the future of this church, and it's just one insignificant town in western Pennsylvania with all of that talent. It's only the young lady who wrote to her dad, the priest, who has any baggage from the Episcopal Church. The other 7 came either out of no faith or some other foundation in the Christian family. I'm hopeful. I'm confident, not because of us, but because of what God is doing. I love to say to these young people, and it does make them glad, I love to say, God can't do any worse. You all can't do any worse in your leadership in the church than my generation did. And they smile, and I think they sort of generally think, yeah, I suppose that's true, because you guys really, really, really did it bad. God's doing a new thing. Our God's always doing new things. And he chooses the most unlikely people. And that's part of the perspective that I have as well. Again, that he'd use any of us for these purposes, that he'd use me, broken as I am, for this work, this great work. Is just something that only he understands. I surely don't. That he'd use the likes of us. Again, our greatest characteristic in leadership in the church is, of course, weakness, because it's God's strength that's made perfect and made evident in our weakness. That's my story, and that's our story.